Hey, I'm Dr. Margaret Rutherford, and this is SelfWork on YouTube. So glad you're here. We've got a great guest for you today. Thanks for being here. I started off my morning by listening to your comedy routine.
Oh, which one? Which bit did you
The one
check out?
on your website.
Oh, yeah.
And I laughed. I just thought, I've known some in and out guys.
Oh man, yeah, that takes me back. I haven't, after the pandemic hit, obviously comedy changed and performing in person totally changed. And I remember going back on stage in 2021. So, we were kind of used to we were opening up a little bit, and the vibe was just really different. And so I've slowly been getting my feet.
Thought about that. How was it different, Priyanka?
Well, first of all, it was an outdoor show and most people were wearing masks, but even if you're doing an indoor show, it's hard to see people's facial expressions if they're masked, right? So that, to me, stand-up has always been a relationship between the performer and the audience. It's a connection. And when you cover the face for obvious important reasons, safety reasons, it sort of breaks that connection. And so what I found was that I enjoyed comedy less, enjoyed performing less after the pandemic. And I actually took a break from comedy and I sort of went back to like, okay, what does bring me joy? Like, what is this really about? Mm-hmm. And I went to France and I actually studied clowning with Philippe Gaulier, who's a world-renowned clowning expert. Wow. And I went back to the basics of like, okay, physical comedy, like comedy with your body and not just your neck up, mind, voice. And then I sort of came into singing parody songs, and that's kind of the new stuff that I'm working on now. Yeah, so I'm taking my comedy and I'm turning it into more parody songs, and I've released a few small clips on Instagram, but I'm planning on releasing a longer video at some point. So that's kind of what I'm working on, and that's like part of the transformation as an artist, it's an incredible journey.
Well, and I want to back up, and we kind of started in the middle, didn't we? Or I did.
Yeah.
And so I want to back up and talk about how you got to be. But I'm a huge advocate of and kind of lives. I am this, and I'm that, and I'm something else. So I love that you're living your life that way.
Oh, thank you.
I also listened to the last podcast that you and Sean did, and I thought the story about your either great-grandfather or your grandfather was so touching. That Wali is actually the Arabic name for healer or helper.
Yeah, helper, or like friend of man, helper of man. Yeah, it was a name bestowed upon us. Yeah.
That is incredible.
Yeah. When I learned that for the first time, and it sort of changed my relationship with my own name. I always thought I didn't really have a relationship, but then once I realized it was sort of like gifted, I was like, wow, there was an identity shift. And, there's a sense of humility and gratitude as well.
When you hear stories like that, my grandmother was named Emma Clayton Robinson. And I remember asking one time, why was her middle name Clayton? And the story was that I'm from the South. I'm from Arkansas, and her mother and father's home was taken over by the Yankees during the Civil War by a General Clayton.
Okay.
He was so kind to them that when my grandmother was born, she was named Emma Clayton Robinson.
Wow.
And Clayton has become one of our family names, which is just so, I don't know, it adds something to your understanding of your family and what has happened. And of course,
right.
It's just, I don't know, there's something about that kind of tradition or legacy that's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I'm curious, do you know what was the name prior to Clayton before that?
Well, no, she had not been. She was born,
Mm.
and then they named her Emma Clayton Robinson.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
There's so many complexities to that story because on one hand, this person was the oppressor. They came in and they took, your family home and your land,
right.
and yet they were a kind oppressor, kind enough for us to name them after them. It's like there's so many nuances to that story. It's very complex. It certainly would be totally justifiable to bring up a lot of different set of feelings around that.
Yeah, I think so. So I want to find out about your journey. You're a physician. You're
Mm-hmm.
an internal medicine physician, and I
Mm-hmm.
think you also have training in obesity. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
double board certified.
Double
Mm-hmm.
board certified. And so, and then you laughed with your co-host Sean about I really want to be just a doctor on TV, and
Yeah.
so,
I just want a small role on Grey's Anatomy. Is that too much to ask for? I mean, come on.
so I would love to hear. There's a lot of doctors in your family, and you told that story, but
Yeah.
how did you decide to become a physician? And are you American born? Were you born in India or were you born in America?
Yeah, great question. So I was born in the United States. So I'm Kashmiri Pundit. So my family originates from northern Kashmir, and that region was actually affected by genocide as recent as 1991. And so that led to a diaspora and immigration all over the world. And my family chose the United States. And so I was born in Los Angeles, but I actually spent some early formative years going back and forth between India and the United States up until I was age 3. And so, my childhood upbringing, my parents were doctors, their siblings are doctors, their kids are doctors. I mean, and the lineage goes further up the chain. So healing was really, we would not have normal dinner discussions, like the dinner table discussions were about like the cases my dad had and like, all this sort of preventive medicine stuff. And so I joke, like I sort of came out of the womb holding a stethoscope. It was something that I lived, breathed. It wasn't until I went to college that I was like, oh, people can do other things. You know what I mean? And I always had an artistic side to me. And so I always loved performing arts and creative writing. And that's always been a very big part of my sort of soul's energy. And at the same time, the science also would come to me quite easily. And so I found myself, going through the pre-med classes, and I actually was accepted into a program coming out of high school called a baccalaureate MD program. It no longer exists, but it was a program where you basically got accepted into medical school coming out of high school.
Really?
It was a very competitive program. They only took, I think, like 12 or 15 people all across the United States. And so I knew out of high school that I was going to go to med school. Yeah. And I can't say honestly, though, that was what I wanted. I think there was a part of me that really was, I loved creative arts. I loved performing. And I couldn't see a path if I were to pursue medicine. But I grew up in a very traditional Indian family. Like I had a tremendous amount of pressure from my parents. Like, no, you have to go to med school. Like that's going to happen. Yeah. And so, again, because the science would come to me easily, I decided to sort of give it a go and give it a chance. In hindsight, I wish I had taken some time off in between undergrad and med school because I went straight through, and I don't necessarily recommend that. I think if I had had more time to sort of develop and simmer as a human being, I wasn't really a human being by the time I went to med school. I was just this concept, I was so undeveloped as a person.
You just followed the structure that your parents wanted you to follow and really hadn't had a whole lot of autonomy about
totally. Yeah. And, it would come out in these different ways. Like when I was a med student, I joined this local improv troupe in East Los Angeles, and I would have these little pockets of things that I would do to create balance.
Sure.
And it's funny now because the work that I do as a physician, I am very passionate about it now, but I think it's because I've taken much more of a an identity that this is part of social justice activism in terms of like what is going on right now with the current medical paradigm and what needs to change. I feel like very compelled now to be involved with this and to be a part of this because at the end of the day, we're all connected. And I feel like I was given a set of privileges by being born into a family that, was all healthcare providers on some aspect. And I feel like it would really be a waste to squander those gifts, essentially. And so it's funny because now I really love what I do and the way I've sort of built my life. I mean, I'm definitely not working like a traditional medical doctor at like, a major hospital or anything like that. I mean, I have my own private practice and the way I think about healing, I would say it's more consistent with like a new paradigm as opposed to the older paradigm. In terms of
more holistic,
integrative, thinking about issues from a mind-body perspective, as opposed to the current paradigm is like, you have a heart problem, you go to a heart doctor. You have a kidney problem, you go to a kidney doctor. You have a mind problem, you go to the mind doctor. It's like that. It's very disconnected. And, there's no more like general doctors anymore. I mean, it's like, it's a rare dying breed. And so I am really trying to bring a call back to, hey, let's look at the whole person. Let's treat the whole person. This is not just a mind issue or a body issue. This is a mind-body issue. And essentially, we are all mind-body spirits.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I was always interested, and I remember asking my, she's my manager, why does Priyanka want to come on SelfWork? I mean, why does she want to come on a mental health podcast? And I want to ask you that question. I was so intrigued that, and it sounds like it's very maybe tied into this. Well, one, of course, you're an example of someone who is saying, don't be governed by, what other people expect of you, but make sure that you're zoning in and really expressing the parts of yourself that bring you joy and that kind of thing, which I think is wonderful. I didn't know if you had any history with depression or anxiety or anything like that, but it also sounds like maybe it's tied in with more of this holistic view of things.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. So yeah, I've talked about this publicly. I think there was an article in Women's Health magazine where I actually was very depressed in medical school. In fact, I didn't realize that I had the signs and symptoms of clinical depression until my psychiatry rotation in medical training, where I was interviewing people. Yeah, I was interviewing people who were severely clinically depressed. And I was walking away from these interviews with individuals and I was like, there's really no difference between me and this person that like probably needs to be hospitalized. And, it was then that so it was then that I realized that, I had severe clinical depression and I needed to be on antidepressants for a period of time in medical training. And what in hindsight coming out of that, what really was going on is that I was in a very difficult situation. The medical system, the medical training system, it's actually a very oppressive system. And I didn't have the best coping skills. I didn't even know what therapy was at the time. And fortunately, that's when I learned about treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy. And I started therapy. I saw a psychiatrist and was able to get the help that I needed. And then when I graduated medical school, my depression symptoms went away and I was able to get off the meds. And I haven't had a relapse of depression to that severity since then.
So it was probably very situational and that kind of thing.
It was absolutely situational. Yeah.
I have the fancy title of adjunct professor at University of Arkansas Medical School, Medical School of Medical Sciences, I think it's called. And I laughed and said, I don't even get a parking place with that. So
yeah. And
I teach a course that's an hour and a half in one semester. So it's very little about psychotherapy to medical students who are doing a psychiatry rotation. And one of my major questions is, what do y'all think therapy is? And they just kind of stare at me.
Oh, yeah.
What are you talking about? And oh yeah, well, now we've learned that this is what you do with this person. And I said, you know what? You got to throw all that out because that's not really true. But it's fascinating how unfortunately, the medical schools still don't really incorporate a whole lot of mental health knowledge and understanding to physicians.
I really appreciate you naming this because it's something I talked about, I think, on one of the podcast episodes. In medicine, we are sort of taught that if you can't objectively identify the cause of someone's issues, like, for example, if you can't get lab work that can corroborate, or a CAT scan or something like that, we're literally taught, or at least back when I was in med school, I was taught that you need to conclude that this is a psychosomatic issue. And once you label someone as having a psychosomatic issue, you kind of wash your hands of it and move on. What the deficit in education right now that's happening in the system, I think physicians especially need to be taught the next step. If you're going to label someone as having a psychosomatic issue, the next training is understanding, okay, well, what is the emotion that's linking to that physical symptom?
Well, the trauma or exactly. What's going on, name what's going on with the patient. I love it. I did my dissertation, on conversion disorders. So
okay, sure.
I was, bridging the gap between, for those listeners who don't know what conversion disorders are, they are disorders that are psychologically based, but can mimic true medical problems. And I did mine on pseudo seizures, which someone looks like they're having a seizure, but there's no actual abnormal EEG activity. So, although they can be mixed. Anyway, enough about that. But I'm always, I'm so glad that at least there's a movement toward physicians moving. There's a movement toward moving.
A lot of movement.
A lot of movement toward integrative or this kind of medicine, because I just think it's vital.
Oh, not only is it vital, Margaret, I actually am at the point in my career where I'm sort of, if anyone's going to call themselves a physician or even a healer for that matter, and they don't have a basic understanding of this type of education, they actually have an incomplete education of how healing actually works in human beings. And so what I would love to see more of is more education for medical students, especially helping them understand how to name emotions and the effects that has on the human body.
Sure. Because isn't there research? In fact, I've read some research that says the brain actually can't tell the difference between physical pain and emotional pain.
That's correct. Actually, yes. When we experience emotional pain, it activates the same receptors of the brain. This is through functional MRI studies. It activates the same receptors of the brain as if we were to experience physical pain.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, all we're naming here, again, is this is more and more evidence of how we need to move towards a mind-body model. A model in medicine. And I do believe this will be the next paradigm where we start to look at human beings as mind bodies and not just bodies with minds.
Right. Biopsychosocial.
Spiritual. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So let's switch gears.
Okay.
Talk about the clown part of you or the funny part of you, the comedic part of you. You have a wonderful podcast yourself that's very, very popular. It's called, let me see if I can not this, HypochondriActor.
HypochondriActor.
I'm so used to saying the word hypochondriacal that
yeah, totally. We just call it hypo for short.
And your partner in crime
is the lovely Sean Hayes, who you may know from a small show called Will and Grace.
Tiny little show.
Yeah.
In fact, my trainer, I was working out this morning and I told him who I was who I was interviewing. He goes, did you say that her cohort, her partner is Sean Hayes? And I said, yeah. Oh, I can't wait to tell my girlfriend that you're interviewing someone who has a
Yeah. Sean's darling. I love working with him. It's been a pleasure. And I don't know when this episode is getting released, but he's currently on Broadway at the moment. So I do miss him because he's very, very busy on Broadway. But it has been just an absolute joy working alongside with him because
great
he
together.
brings
You're
oh,
very
thank
nice
you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so easy to work with someone who's so lighthearted as Sean, and he brings just a lot of joy and humor. And on the podcast we're talking about, we can talk about some pretty serious things, pretty heavy things, and that lightness that he brings, it allows us to kind of go to places where maybe we wouldn't necessarily be able to go if this was a more serious kind of heavy podcast. It's so important when you're interviewing celebrities or anyone who's willing to share something vulnerable about creating a safe space so that people feel like they can share. And so I feel really grateful to be working alongside him.
And you answer questions from listeners about, is it only medical issues that they call in about, or is it?
Yes. Yeah, so people like to call in and share their medical stories. And it's been also, that has been a very, very humbling experience. The callers that call in and the depths of their shares, as the show has progressed, the shares have been more and more vulnerable, which we so appreciate. And what I love about the shares is that people will many times call in and say, I thought I was the only person that had blah, blah, blah. But after listening to this episode, I realize I'm not, and I have it too. And this is my experience. And that's, to me, is what this is really about, connecting us, reminding us that we're all one people, we're one species, we're human beings, and we feel the same things, and emotions do connect us. And I think that's so important to remember in this time of such divisiveness.
On SelfWork, I also love to answer questions from listeners. It's one of my most favorite things to do. And so it's, you're right. I just feel like there's so many, there's this, again, research will say that there's this explosion of loneliness, and it's true. And staring at our screens instead of talking to one another. And so there's this sense of, I must be the only one feeling this. So since the pandemic happened, what are you doing with, you said you went to France and you're doing this clowning and that kind of thing. Tell us about that part of you.
Yeah. So, I think in order for me to stay balanced, it is very important that I engage in some kind of play. Yeah. And it can be formal play, like going to study clowning with a renowned clowning expert. But on a day-to-day, like every day, I can't fly to France to study clowning. I do spend a significant part of my day, like I dance every day. I try and do some kind of movement, especially before I start to see individuals in my private practice. I may put on a song and just move my body, and I get really funky and really weird, and I'll growl. I love growling, and I love putting my yoga mat out and just like rolling on the floor and just like moving and arching my back and acting like a total fool. I mean, just like completely, just like it's just an animal. But to me, it's important for me to do that every day. I think we forget that we human beings, we're animals, and so we have to engage in somatic practices. Otherwise, we'll be very disconnected from our bodies. And in my own healing journey, I've noticed that the more I'm in my body, the more present I am, and the more I can give, the more I can share sort of the gifts that I have. And we all have gifts to share. And I've just noticed that the more I engage in somatic practices, it's easier for me to tap into that. And play, I also consider rest to be a really important facet. I mean, resting, going slow, taking naps, anything that just, again, keeps the body in flow. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I'm generally a very silly person. And
people always ask me, well, how do you do something so serious all day long? And I think, I laugh all the time with people.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot to we're not laughing. I'm not laughing at people. I'm laughing with people that I see. We find things to laugh about because it's so important for them to laugh and it's important for me to laugh.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And laughing is, there's studies to show that laughter literally will lower cortisol levels in the blood. It'll lower inflammatory markers. I mean, it's just a really great feeling. And I think that's why while I was a resident working 80 hours a week,
Sure.
I gravitated towards stand-up comedy and performing comedy because it was this one thing that I could do solo on my own terms. And there's an immediate feedback. You make the audience laugh like you've done it. That's the feedback. And it's spontaneous. You can't fake it. Well, maybe you can fake it, but like a real belly laugh, really hard to fake. That big old belly laugh.
For those listeners who are out there going, how do you get the courage to stand up there for 5 or 8 minutes and try out these jokes? Because I know I've heard enough conversations with stand-up comedians that they go to hundreds of these clubs and try out material, and sometimes it dies. I was lucky enough to hear Ellen DeGeneres when she was young.
Oh, nice. Wow.
And I can remember thinking, this lady's going somewhere. I was
wow.
And but I know it just must be grueling, and I don't know, how did you rake up, or whatever we would say, the courage to do it?
Yeah. So, I was a resident and I had just broken up with a long-term relationship. So I was really going through a process where I was really just trying to figure out, who am I coming out of this very long relationship. And I sort of took some time and I was like, what is it that I really need? What is it that I really want? And I searched it, and then the answer was like, I want laughter and I want to make people laugh. And, to be completely honest, stand-up was a morbid fear of mine. It was something that I could have never imagined myself doing, but I sort of willed it within myself. I was like, you know what? It's just going to be a one-time thing. It was supposed to be like a bucket list thing. Like, I'm going to do stand-up once and then that's it. And I'm writing it off. But what happened is I was in San Francisco training and I Google searched good place to try stand-up comedy for the first time in San Francisco. And the first hit that came up on Google was a laundromat / cafe / open mic place where people, they have an open mic and people are like folding their laundry while you're like telling jokes. And yeah, the website said this is a good place to try stand-up comedy for the first time in San Francisco. So I go to Brainwash Cafe / laundromat, and there were 3-minute sets. So I wrote 3 minutes of jokes. They now in hindsight, they weren't funny at all, but they were all I could do at the time. Mm-hmm. And I go to the laundromat, I do a 3-minute set. It went well. And just, it happened to be that afternoon in the audience was a local producer who produced shows locally in the Bay Area. And he came up to me after my set. He's like, you were really funny. Like, do you want to do my showcase, which is in a month? No. And I was shocked. And I was like, sure. And he's like, I need you to do 10 minutes and it's next month. See you next month. And so I was like, I told him, yeah, absolutely. But in my mind, I was like, 10 minutes. I don't even have 10 seconds of good material. So, what I ended up doing is I started going to other open mics so I could prep for that one showcase. But then what happened is that at those other open mics, other comedians who had shows, they would see me and they were like, hey, I want you to do my show. And so by the time I had that showcase a month out, I actually had all these other showcases lined up. And the next thing I knew, I was in it. I was deep in it. And it really just transformed. And then I was like, this is a lot of fun. I'm not going to stop. And so I just kept doing it. And then years passed and then more opportunities arose. And then I started doing commercials and it turned into this whole other world. But it really originated for me wanting to face this small fear and just like seeing what would happen.
I hope my listeners are listening to this because, one of the things that I say probably, too many times is it doesn't matter where you go. It matters that you go.
Oh, yes.
So it sounds like you just said, this is a fear of mine. I want to confront it. You didn't have plans necessarily to become, a stand-up comedian, but you just went where, you went in a direction, and for 3 minutes.
Yes. And those 3 minutes literally changed my life. Yeah.
Yes.
And, over the years, my relationship with fear has evolved. It's only years later that I realized, when we experience fear, and I'm not talking about the real fear, like if there's a tiger about to maul you or, a car going to hit you or something like that. Forget about that sort of fear, like actual real fear, but just sort of the existential fear, that everyday fear. To me now, when I experience that in relation to a specific situation, I actually view that as a sign that I'm getting close to some area of transformation. Yeah. Fear is a sign that you probably are doing something right.
It's a flare from your unconscious mind going, pay attention, pay attention.
Pay attention. Yeah. And so now when I experience fear, my relationship with it is such that I'm like, oh, it seems like this might be an opportunity for transformation.
I just love your story.
Thank you.
And what's the next and?
So there's a couple of things in the pipeline. I mean, I just want to name to piggyback off of what you're saying. Again, when I first started doing stand-up, I never thought it would pivot to doing more social justice activism about better treatment for physicians. I never thought it would lead to educating the general public about complex medical issues in the form of a podcast that mixes comedy and medicine. Stand-up really is kind of the trunk of the tree, but the branches led to other things. Sure. And for that, I'm very grateful. And so at this point, the podcast is taking up quite a bit of time, and we do have it does. It's a lot of work. And like I said earlier, I am working on a show with parody songs and singing. So I love that you sing, because singing has also been, it's another way of performing that really uses your whole body. And so I'm working on that as well. And then a couple of other projects that I can't really talk about yet, but I'm excited to release soon.
Oh, that's nice. Well, again, we'll have the link to your podcast, but say it because I'll probably crucify it again.
It's HypochondriActor. Episodes are released every Wednesday on all of the channels, Spotify, iTunes, Audible, you name it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And anyway, any other ways people can reach out to you?
Yeah, sure. I'm available on social media, Instagram. You can find me at Wali Priyanka. That's WALI Priyanka, PRIYANKA.
Okay. Well, I like I said, I was up about 5:30 this morning, and I started, and you made me laugh, and you made me laugh hard.
Oh, good.
That was really a fun way to start my morning, and I have loved our conversation.
Likewise.
If you ever want to have a mental health professional on, just keep me in mind.
Yeah, I'd love to stay in touch.
Well, it's lovely to meet you.
Likewise. Bye.
We're so glad you were here today. You can find SelfWork anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we'll be back with something for YouTube soon. Take care. Bye for now.